We've had a small victory in the battle for free speech. Labour's misinformation and disinformation bill is no more. The Liberals, Greens and much of the crossbench signalled the opposition. Now of course, the bill should never have existed to begin with, and went on for far too long. Further, the Liberal Party was dragged kicking and screaming into voting against it. But a win is a win. Now to be clear, Labour does seemingly want to go back to the drawing board and try again, but I suspect they won't be able to do so before the next election. However, the war for free speech is not over, despite this one victory. Labour has now decided to bring along age restrictions on social media. These are operationalised under the euphemistically titled Online Safety Amendments, which are currently under consideration. The problem with these is how they're structured, as I'm going to go through. Now these limits would attempt to impose minimum age restrictions for social media. At a very high level, we can see that this might have some merit. We can debate about what exactly the age limit should be, but I have some sympathy for the idea that very young kids can be vulnerable to bad actors. I also have some sympathy for the proposition that kids might post things that they would later regret. Kids might be pushing the boundaries, and ultimately we don't want to hold things that they say when they're very young against them forever, because the internet is forever. We should allow people to grow up without ruining their lives for something they posted when they were 12. But as with everything, the devil is in the detail. In an attempt to supposedly protect the children, Labour has introduced far-reaching social media controls. Frankly, under Labour, they're using children as pawns to force through Draconian laws, which are the thin edge of the wedge. Effectively, it reminds me of the exhortations in The Simpsons of, "Oh, won't somebody think of the children?" which are being used every time someone is trying to bring in Draconian laws. As you can see, expertly parodied in The Simpsons when it was funny.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Think of the children. Won't somebody please think of the children?
No, stop. Think of the children.
So what exactly is the problem with the bill? Well, to my mind, it starts with the process. The process was fundamentally flawed. They allowed literally 1 day of public consultation, 1 day for the public to make submissions, and those submissions were limited to 1 to 2 pages. That as a starting point tells us all we need to know. Labour was trying to force this through with minimal public scrutiny. That is a signal, and it's truly a sham of a public consultation. It's utterly reprehensible that they'd attempt to slip through a bill with so little time for feedback. That alone should cause the bill to stall, and should cause the bill to be paused until there is genuine public consultation. Even if one happens to agree with what the bill is doing, and I don't, the process itself is so flawed, it needs to be stopped or slowed down. Second, the bill requires social media platforms to take, quote, reasonable steps to verify the age of people to ensure that they are over the age of 16. So what exactly are those reasonable steps? Well, the bill doesn't say, but it would involve social media platforms seemingly trying to verify the identity and age of all users on the platform. How else would you know if someone is over 16? You'd have to actually check everyone who is using the platform. It's not just going to impact kids, which is bad enough, it's going to impact every Australian using social media, unless that person happens to have a VPN, and I'll link to a VPN in the description below for you to check out if you happen to be interested. But in any case, this verification could potentially take the form of facial screening, or facial scanning, identification documents, or some form of government digital ID. Now, the idea of a government digital ID itself is repulsive, but that was passed. It was supposed to be voluntary, and people were supposed to be able to decide to not use it if they didn't want to use it. People, however, at the time warned that eventually, while it was phrased as being voluntary, it would eventually become required to do even basic things and become de facto compulsory. Well, here we are. The digital ID seemingly would be one way of trying to verify your identity with social media platforms, so that the government has full access to your social media accounts, or at least your social media handles. That should be concerning. Furthermore, we would have the idea that the social media companies might be scanning people's identification documents. The social media companies would then have things such as your name, your address, your date of birth, etc., etc. For some people, that might already be the case, but for others, it won't be. And for many people, they want to remain anonymous online. And even if they're not anonymous per se in relation to the social media company, they don't want the government to follow their social media. You might be okay with random advertisements coming to you because in reality, the social media companies really just want to sell you junk that you don't actually need. But it's a whole other thing for the government to be following your social media. That goes into the area of civil liberties. Now, when the social media companies collect this data, they're supposed to destroy the primary information source. For example, destroy the identification document that you have. However, as we've seen with some data hacks, that doesn't actually seem to always occur, and sometimes they do seemingly actually store the raw identification data. Furthermore, there would seemingly be a very high chance that it would actually retain the actual data, such as names, locations, birth dates, etc. This gives social media companies the ability to target individuals, and not only that, when coupled with additional laws, government would then be able to obtain the data. So think of it this way. The social media companies collect the identification data under this particular law, then the government goes back to the drawing board with a censorship bill, and then that censorship bill can enable them to get the information and the identification from the social media companies, which has now been collected. Effectively, the collection tool here is just the starting point for additional bills. We should get rid of it at the start and not even run that risk, at least to my mind. The government is salami slicing away our civil liberties. Then you add onto this the risk of just data hacks. If these social media companies are storing a honeypot of data, well, it makes them more attractive to hackers and makes it more attractive to data breaches. And even if those hacks come in the form of phishing hacks as opposed to actually a data breach per se, it still is a bit of a vulnerability. Third, the bill has a broad definition of social media platforms, which effectively includes any site with an interaction feature. The government has been all over the place in relation to what exactly this would include. At one point it would include Snapchat or not include Snapchat, and at another point they would backflip. At one point it would include YouTube, another point not include YouTube. They seemingly can't make up their mind. I think that's a concern because the government should be able to tell us which of these big platforms are within its remit before the bill goes through. How on earth are we supposed to actually trust a bill when we don't even know what it is going to cover? Now, Labour, therefore, has been all over the place in relation to what this bill even does. It beggars belief that they bring a bill to Parliament when they can't even tell us which platforms it would affect and have a consistent line about this. Furthermore, it would appear to also impact small online forums, such as those that might be for watch enthusiasts or car enthusiasts, that type of thing. But these small forums might be hobbyist forums and completely unable to comply with this greater regulation, because complying with this regulation is going to cost money. It imposes a cost onto the platforms. Now, something like a YouTube can maybe pass this on via more advertisements. However, an online forum can't very well do this. They can't really paywall many of these forums very effectively. This means government is effectively trying to kill off a small business. Maybe that's not the actual purpose behind the law, but that's what it's going to do. And much like with many Labour regulations, they don't seemingly actually care whether it costs people money. It's more red tape, and more red tape that people don't even really want. It's baffling that they want to go through with this, but in reality, it seemingly is just an exercise in control. And this bill would capture broad swathes of online content, and seemingly require an ID of some kind to use the internet. The short of this bill is it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Now, at the moment, we can't really do very much about this, because the election is going to be sometime in 2025, and it's very difficult to get rid of the government before the election. Maybe if Anthony Albanese gets incredibly unpopular, he will be deposed. But then, do we actually think his replacement is going to be any better? Furthermore, the Liberals seemingly are actually going along with these types of identification. So it's not like the Liberals are having a consistent line on this either. Perhaps our only solution at the moment is to write to your local member and try to convince them that they should not be going along with this bill. Or if you have access to it, maybe try to write an op-ed in your local newspaper or something similar to try to express how bad this bill is. Or maybe a letter to the editor in a newspaper. Now that might not make a huge difference, but at least if some politicians see how unpopular the bill is, maybe it will shift some voting behavior. I wouldn't get my hopes up, but perhaps it will cause some small change. Nevertheless, let me know your thoughts about this bill and Labour's censorship attempts in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you think.